Hi, everyone. So welcome. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean of the GSD, and I want to begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what's now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. So before we jump into tonight's event, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available for our virtual audience, because this is at once an in-person event and a Zoom event. So to enable captions, click the close captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I also want to invite you to join us for additional GSD public programs taking place this week alone. It's amazing what happens here. So Wednesday, on March 23rd at 6:30 p.m. here in Gund, the GSD, the Mittal Institute, and the Museum of Modern Art will convene leading scholars working on architecture in South Asia for a conversation about reconceptualizing conservation practices. This event will be moderated by Yves Blau, who's an adjunct professor of history and theory of urban form and design here at the GSD. And then on Thursday, also here in Gund, the GSD and the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies will be kicking off their symposium, Bringing Digitalization Home, How Can Technology Address Housing Challenges, with a keynote address at 6:30 p.m. by Molly Wright-Steenson, who's the Vice Provost for Faculty and the K&L Gates Associate Professor of Ethics and Computational Technology and Associate Professor of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon. I have to say, I say all that with some trepidation because she was my student a long time ago, and I think, God, she's Vice Provost of the faculty at Carnegie Mellon. So the symposium continues on Friday and Saturday. More information about all GSD events can be found on the GSD's website. All of our lectures will be live streamed for our public audience. Harvard ID holders are also welcome to attend programs in person. And now for tonight's event, Archive Matrix Assembly, which is generously supported by the Rouse Visiting Artists Fund. So I'm very excited that we're joined in conversation with the artist Thomas Struth and the art and architectural theorist Nana Last, who's Associate Professor of Architecture at UVA. This event stems from the recent publication of Nana's book, Archive Matrix Assembly, which is about Thomas's work. It's not often that we're able to have here in one event both the author of an analytical text and the subject of that text. This event gives us the opportunity to look into the construction of an argument on an artistic practice as well as that artistic practice itself. To give you a little run of show, I'll quickly introduce our two guests. Nana will then give a quick summary of her book's argument, and then we'll settle into conversation, which won't be as quick. And then we'll open it up to questions from our live audience as well as our Zoom audience. So Thomas Struth is a German artist who studied at the Düsseldorf Kunstakademie from 1973 to 1980, starting off first studying painting with Gerhard Richter, and then shifting to photography, studying under Bernd and Hillebecher. This biographical information is important not so much for pedigree as for context. Among the school's alumni are photographers Andreas Gursky, Thomas Ruff, and Candida Hofer, who were all studying under the Bechers around the same time. And the second important context to pay attention to is that of post-war Germany, a particularly charged context, as Thomas himself has frequently noted. On a personal note, I first met Thomas at an exhibition of his work called Nature and Politics that inaugurated Rice's Moody Art Center in 2017. While that was already 5 years ago, those photographs are still very vivid in my head, a factor of their scale, their detail, as well as their subject matter, which was a combination of science labs and landscapes. We had dinner during his stay in Houston, and I was delighted to discover, as you will this evening, that these photographs, which seemed so technical and objective and admittedly a little cold, were taken by someone with a remarkable warm humanity and deep social politics. Nana Last, as I've noted, teaches history theory studio and doctoral research courses at UVA, where she was the founding director of the Ph.D. program in constructed environment. I'll also note that she graduated from the GSD with an MArch in 1986, something that a dean has to always note, so you're one of ours. In addition to this book, Nana has published a book called Wittgenstein's House, Language, Space, and Architecture, and she's currently working on a book that is tentatively titled From Text to Algorithm, Architecture, and Big Data. On a final note, I'd like to thank Nana for inadvertently teaching me to be less of a literalist. When I started the PhD program at MIT, I went up to sign up for office hours with my advisor, and there were already a bunch of names signed up, mostly only listing first names, except for one, the final one on the list, which was Nana Last. Frustrated that Nana had claimed that hers would be the last meeting, even though there were 2 more slots on the list, I left and emailed to inquire if more times would open up, only to learn, as you've all figured out, that hers wasn't the last time slot after all. It's a real pleasure to welcome my former classmate to give us a short summary of her fantastic book, Archive Matrix Assembly, and to join us in conversation afterwards. Welcome, and thank you both.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for that introduction. You do tell that story, so I can never forget it. But I wanted to give a bit of an overview of both the book and of Thomas's work before we start our conversation. So just getting into that. The book presents a systematic theory of the evolution of Thomas Struth's photographic work since its origins in the late 1970s. While it chronicles the evolution of the work, its conceptual starting point is really the work in its entirety. And towards this, its central proposition is that Struth's work is most meaningful when understood as having developed through these 3 stages: archive, matrix, and assembly. Each of these stages characterizes the individual photographs and series, their relation to their subject matter, and their mode of transforming individual images into larger, meaningful collectives. Together, the 3 stages form what I think of as Struth's larger project of non-separation. I'm going to move through some of these, but if you can kind of keep this image in your head, I'll refer back to it. Towards this, I wanted to give you just a very quick history of Struth's work, and before I get into the specific proposition that the book puts forth. So the core of Struth's artwork are 4 clearly defined photographic archives of discrete subject matter and photographic perspective. These began in the late 1970s with his central perspective urban streetscapes, and continued soon after with his portraits, museum, photographs, and landscapes. So just if you think of the black and white ones as some of the early ones, but to move on to some of the portraits, so you have a sense of those as well. Stop there. By the early 2000s, the introduction of new series reached what I understand to be a critical moment in its development, an inflection point. At this juncture, it stood poised to do one of 2 things: to either continue indefinitely in the same vein, introducing new series while adding images to existing ones, or to alter the very terms that define the conception, focus, and amassing of his photographic production. I argue that it chose the latter. So beginning around 2007, there's a proliferation of photographs that repeatedly explore unexpected terrain. This is just some more of the museum ones. And more so, they offer scenes that challenge more singular categorizations. Let's move to there. So So we see Struth's more recognizable context of city streets and family and so on, largely replaced with a set of intersecting realms of the biological, technological, industrial, and natural. Its images range from photographs of the space shuttle to Disneyland rides to patients in the operating room to entangled masses of wires, gauges, pipes, circuits, and other technological devices, and finally deceased animals in a zoological lab. I'm just trying to get to one of the animals. It gives you a sense of the range of these. This is what I'm trying to show. Okay. While most writing on Struth's work looks at the series as if in isolation from another, I take a radically different tact. First, the book addresses the entirety of his photographic work, and second, and even more centrally, it proposes that the discontinuities in the body of work must be considered equally with its continuities. Toward this, it looks at how the repeated jumps in subject matter and image formation play a central role in propelling not just the overall advancement of the work, but the development within the individual images and series themselves. So the evolutionary system it proposes is then defined by three analytical terms in the book's title: archive, matrix, and assembly. The first phase is the archive. The archive uses a logic of dissociation and repetition to produce the originating content. So you can imagine some of the black and white images you saw to begin. The initial discrete single-subject archives are the clearest example of this, especially the small black and white central perspective urban streetscapes. The second stage is the matrix. It begins with the material from the archives and re-envisions it through associative operations to produce a series of hybrids. It's less involved in producing entirely new series than in hybridizing existing ones in unforeseen ways. Towards this, it builds on the original archives to yield notable changes. So, for example, the small black and white central perspective streetscapes, largely devoid of people, become large streetscapes seen from a multitude of perspectives and with people playing a noticeable role. Let's just go back to, it doesn't go back that easily. Another example of this are the museum photographs that in the archive phase depicted museum visitors from the back as they view paintings on the wall, to his 2004 audience series that turns the camera on those same museum viewers to make them the central focus and audience. Sorry, I'm having sort of some issues getting this to move. No. Anyway, we'll move on. You'll see them as they go around. So the audience series then looks directly at the people who are viewing the artist, almost as if from the viewpoint of the artist, of the artwork itself. Now with this, I argued that the audience series can then be seen to join the museum series to the portrait series, transforming how we see both series in the process. In this stage, the archive's mutually exclusive topics then are transformed into a set of charged relations. The shift turns the archives and the spaces between them into an active place of exchange, a resulting field of interactions in which images from one series look to ideas from the other series to create previously unimagined approaches to the subject matter. And finally, the third phase. The assembly phase is what I define as covering a lot of Struth's most recent work. And what it does is it takes as content what the matrix employed as operation. It can thus be thought of as a sort of meta-matrix. I use assembly to describe both the photograph's frequent focus on technological and other complexes, as well as the way the photographs act in concert with one another, as if in varying components operating together towards a larger purpose. Its conceptual core really are matter drawn across many fields, from advanced science and technology to manufacture and urban sprawl. Beyond their focus, the assembly stage images cohere in a fundamentally new manner. The images form neither archives nor a field of interactions, but instead create clusters of interrelated images in which the photographs assume disparate roles. These clusters, sometimes as few as 3 or 4 images, and at other times more than 10, replace the logic of a singular photographic approach with an expanded range of photographic scales and viewpoints. Accordingly, none of the assembly clusters are exactly alike. So a couple examples here. The first is Struth's neutral buoyancy lab photographs that were taken at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And the centerpiece of the lab itself is a full-scale mock-up of the International Space Station submerged in an enormous pool. Struth's photographs of that don't all repeat the same logic. Instead, it couples this oblique view of the overview with a series of very tightly framed photographs that look directly down at sections of the submerged space station, and these are all tinged blue. I don't think we have one of those here. But a second example is from this series. And These are a series of photographs that were taken at the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research, and they form a more complex assembly that includes an overview, discrete images of recently deceased animals being examined, and a close-up of this recently removed brain that we see here that makes clear that the photographs concern not individual animals, but the lab as an active scientific and socio-political entity that encompasses a range of activities. The end result, I argue, of this ongoing enterprise is not a series of discrete photographs, but an evolving system of thought. One, as I was saying, I call the larger project of non-separation. And just a quote to end this that I used actually to open the book, but I think it summarizes both this thinking, the approach of the book itself, but also I think the very work, and ties it to a broader epistemology. And that's a quote from William James's Essays on Radical Empiricism from about 1904. And he wrote, "If empiricism had only been radical and taken everything that comes without disfavor, conjunction as well as separation, each at its face value, the results would have called for no such artificial correction. Radical empiricism does full justice to conjunctive relations, without, however, treating them as rationalism tends to treat them, as being true in some supernal way, as if the unity of things and their variety belong to different orders of truth and vitality altogether." So that ends this little summary, and
that was very interesting, and I know the book, so I know the argument. You can't escape, Thomas. So I have several questions that I want to ask about your work, but I want to start really by talking about the argument and also, frankly, what it's like for you, Thomas, to have someone come in and create this argument around your work. In previous interviews, I've noted that you've kind of resisted the term series. And so it's been interesting to try and hear you talk about how your work might get categorized in different ways. And then here comes Nana, and she sets it up in a way that I think is quite provocative. And I wonder, one, how that speaks to you in terms of reorganizing your work. Is it that, oh, of course, you figured it out, the secret? And two, how much it comes through conversation. The two of you have been in conversation for a long time, and so if you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Yes, I mean, a few things come up listening to you. One thing, the first thing is I'm not interested in photography per se. When somebody like photography festival or I was thinking, what does that mean? Photography or picture making is only good when you have to want to say something about something that you're interested in. Photography per se is not interesting. I come from painting, so I come from the arts into photography, and I'm a fairly impatient person, so at a certain point, after painting for a while, I just thought, I just found out for myself that photographing was more quicker and also more directed to the public and to some shared experience that I can share with other people. We met for the first time through the fact that I received this paper before I met Nana, by somebody wrote in my mind a very interesting piece about my work as a reflection of an exhibition that I had at the Dallas Museum of Art, which in 2002, which was the first venue of 4 venues I had in the United States. And I was very surprised because the person who had written the article didn't ask me anything. She didn't ask me for photographs or what I was thinking, and came up with this very, very interesting resuming article where I felt like finally somebody understands what I'm doing. Yeah, so it was a big pleasure. So I called, or I wrote anonym. I found out email address. I wrote to her. We met in New York, and then the idea arose to maybe you write a longer thing about it. She came to my studio in Düsseldorf at the time. We spent a week together, and then the whole thing took so long because I was doing more work and more work and more work, so she constantly had to find time to write more and make it longer and longer and longer. So it took 10 years or something like that for the book to be published. The other thing that comes up is that that a long time ago, Hilla Becher said to me, "Oh, with street photographs, you have this fantastic theme, and you can go. You do that until you die." And I thought immediately, no. That's not me. I don't. That's not my plan. And maybe I don't know how much of a role that played when I was a student at the Academy in Düsseldorf. The art world was much smaller, so it's completely uncomparable with today. But we had the opportunity in Düsseldorf to have two important galleries there and many artists visiting the Academy for a guest lecture or something like that. So I had the opportunity to meet people in person and also to have very early observations when I was 20 or 21 about careers, so to speak, and how works of art develop and which artist was doing the same thing the entire career, and in which cases it was a good idea or it made sense, like for example Mike Rothko or somebody like that. I mean, he was dead already, but and in which sense maybe people had betrayed their original strong work already. So I made all these observations. Of course, from a humble perspective as a young guy, but in retrospect, that was very interesting to observe.
So you said at one point that the museum series was finished when you did the ones in the Prado. And so okay, I'm going to keep sort of talking about series, even though I know you've said you've had some issues with that as a term, because I think you don't see them as so finished. But you did say that series was finished, or the museum pictures were finished once you did the Prado. And so could you speak to how you transition from one subject area to another, and maybe that's also where the assembly and the matrix start to mix up this initial phase of having these discrete archives. But can you speak to your shifts in topic?
Yes, I mean the word series is just so attached to photographic practice. Whereas we could also say the series of self-portraits of Rembrandt, or the series of candle paintings of Gerd Richter, then series doesn't have the same effect on that work. But when you say a series of street pictures, it immediately says that the individual picture doesn't mean much. It's just the whole thing matters, which of course, from my point of view, is nonsense, because on every single picture I spend a lot of attention, maybe not in the beginning with the street pictures. I took so many street pictures, and it was the editing was very important to say, okay, I took 300 photographs of streets in Düsseldorf with a 5x7-inch camera. I mean, 300, and the surviving pictures were maybe 3. Which is totally fine by me. It was just something to practice piano. Before you can play a decent piece, you have to practice a couple of hours. And the transition to another body of work was partly to do that you can only speak. It only makes sense to speak about something as long as you feel you have to say something. I mean, it means it makes sense that you talk so long about something, and when the message is expressed, that's it. You know, it doesn't make sense to go on talking about it. I would say, with the street pictures and the family portraits, they somehow needed. Yeah, that's why it's sort of an archive. Yeah, the street pictures is the most, the body of work where the archive is makes the most sense. And then, you know, it was also the idea of a of the collective unconscious that flows in, that has an importance in what architecture or the urban structure looks like. For example, today I had a meeting with somebody from MIT, so I was down there, we met at the MIT book shop, and I walked around there, and I mean, it sounds strange, but that's what I feel like. The war in the Ukraine, and I'm really extremely worried about this because we live in Berlin, and you know, my family and I, and it's really scary. I mean, it started when I was already here in New York, and then I work in the MIT structure, and I get such a sense of power or empowerment of, you know, Facebook next to Google, next to you know, the MIT lab, and I found it really scary. I found it really like this in George Orwell environment. Such an expression of power, which in a way through my technology, like my work about technology, you know, it's the like the obsession that technology will make our life better, more convenient, and more happy, and that's just bullshit. As we can see, with the war in Ukraine, yeah, the many issues we have, racism, I don't know what, yeah, so you can, the list is endless. So anyhow, but I went to the transition to new work. So the street pictures, you know, more or less I looked at the street scene as an expression of culture and the collective unconscious, and then when I accidentally practically took two family portraits as a gift for families I stayed with in Scotland and in Japan, and I saw these two pictures next to each other, and I thought, this is phenomenal. It's more or less is what I was interested in, the street pictures, only in a small group, and I thought this is a new opportunity. And as you might see, I'm just showing. I have a new show in New York at Marian Goodman Gallery that includes 4 new family portraits, and that subject matter, it's not really an archive, but I can continue. That's always interesting. It's the most difficult work to do because people, and you know, they have their own thing, and it's, you know, it's a sitting, so to speak.
After you've photographed the Queen, you can photograph most people, no?
Yeah, but the Queen for me was an exotic thing to do, like giving food to a flamingo. You know, it's not. You know, that was one thing. When I was asked if I wanted to do this, I said I'd have to think about it for 3 days. I call you back in 3 days, and I thought one thing was, if I would do it and I would be successful, I would always be asked about it. And for me, that picture doesn't matter so much, actually.
Yeah, as a footnote, so Thomas did the official portrait. The National Portrait Gallery asked you to do the official portrait of the Queen and Prince Philip in 2007, 2000, somewhere around there. Maybe the 2011. So I wonder, I want to probe at the assembly category of the book and of the work, because it seems that maybe that's in part also speaks to what you were saying about technology and going down the street and getting scared at MIT and Kendall Square, that there's the work, the technology photographs, the ones that photograph labs and science centers, don't have the serenity of the photographs of the street scenes. They're very threatening, actually, in terms of the amount of stuff that's going on and the amount of detail. And I wonder how assembly might be, in fact, a sort of categorical version of that density and that less clarity or less structure than the earlier photographs, which are formally much neater. And so it's a question both for Nana and Thomas.
Yeah. I mean, for me, as the work went on, when I first started writing about it, those things didn't exist. So then they became as if he was spending his time trying to come up with difficult challenges for me as to what these are.
That also.
The animals being the biggest challenge, but I actually think it's my favorite part of the book in the end, dealing with that. So to me, it was both. You have all these technical scenes, and all of this, and they've been talked about as showing that which is beyond comprehension. But to me, it isn't just that. I feel like there's a sensitivity towards them. There's a sort of logic of these are immensely complex things. It's not like they're beyond comprehension. We're showing complexity. So it was like, really, what could bring together the notion of all these things that were happening at the same time? Say, the technology images, Disneyland, the urban sprawl. I'm blanking on the name of the city that with.
That's Ulsan.
Yeah, Ulsan. And then things that fascinate me, like we see one's called Figure, the surgery image, which also brings together all these issues of technology and the human, and really what I think of as a new subject. So for me, that was like, yeah, it sort of ties to portraits. Obviously, it's not the same thing, but how do we vision people, and what does that mean now? So it was really a question of, what are these all about? And they all seem to be collecting things and logics of bringing things together. And they no longer repeated in the same way, right? And so they had to sort of reimagine both the scale of what was being looked at, and they jumped scales. Whereas the early ones, the prototypical ones, are more similar. These make you see the things differently, like the image of the brain. All of a sudden, I remember very strongly when those were exhibited, you have the overview of this zoological lab, and then you have all these images which are really very beautiful of all these deceased animals, and they're all being studied for what did they die of? Did the environment have an effect? So there's a whole social, political thing about the lab, and then all of a sudden you're walking along and you're just confronted with this brain.
But there's only, the print is that big.
But it's
like
exactly
small,
sort of face-like height, right? And to me, it was like the tie of humans, because you no longer knew what animal. Yeah. It tied many things together, from the science to whatever. And I feel like the logic of these is thinking through problems very differently, and being sort of, for Thomas, best that I can see, confronted with new areas of research and new things that you were interested in, and how you might approach that. So to me, it was this category that allowed the thought process that I could feel going on between images sort of encompass that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, editing and connecting pictures is very essential with photography, or with the picture making. I'm doing, and of course I'm interested in the content and what things mean and how they work together. Yeah, that's absolutely true. The incentive for the technology pictures was really in the sort of in what I said before, the promise of technology and this convenience advancement, and I'm not principally against it. It's just it started with, I gave a workshop at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in New Smyrna Beach in Florida, 3 weeks, where I had 8 postgraduate students with who I spent 3 weeks together, which was was a lot of fun, and like to give my all in 3 weeks, and then say, ciao, good luck. So I had planned, at the end of the 3 weeks, that I'm going to stay 3 days longer there, which when that actually happened, I was very tired and sort of all of a sudden felt very lonely. So I decided I'm going to visit Cape Canaveral because it's not so far, and everybody recommended that. So that was kind of my first example where I felt, even though I'm 67, I was already, when the moon landing happened, I was 13 or 14, so I remember seeing that. But I didn't, when I visited Cape Canaveral, for some reason, I thought, I didn't know how political that was. Actually, I was too naive. I hadn't realized that. And then I thought, I want to come back and photograph there. And that was kind of the starting point of that thing. Once I started with this group, I realized 2 things that I found very exciting. First of all, your new challenges in terms of composition, which of course you scout, you look around, and it's quite difficult because you see a lot of things in extremely rapid succession, but you have to find somewhere to make a picture, and the picture should be summarizing something, and not only the object, the subject matter, but what I want to say about this. And plus the size of the pictures. Before, it was also street pictures were small, the family portraits were that size, the museum photographs needed to be big, the jungle pictures needed to be big, and I never had, the family portraits a bit, but not the opportunity to make a picture of that size and a picture of, let's say, 12 feet or something like that. And that was another interesting opportunity. My standard thought about this was that what I look at in the technology places is something that must have been in people's heads. So somehow it must have been in their imagination to build pieces of sculpture. For somebody who doesn't know anything about what it actually does, pieces of sculpture that became reality through, it's like a brain stamp, an imprint of the brain. And then when you don't know what it is, you just read the atmosphere. What does that tell me? Is there anything in there that's truthful in a certain way to not talk about what it actually is?
That's, a small technical interlude. I have a couple technical questions because you do hit, I think, what is the biggest photograph is something like 4 meters? Is that right?
Well, I have this small number of prints that I made that are bigger than one sheet, print. They're composed of 2 sheets. It's that one from the big one, the more recent one with the red, yellow, and blue. That's from the large
the vertical
Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva. That's a picture, and the other from CERN I'm showing now at Marion Goodman Gallery in New York, and all the following ones. That's maybe 11 feet tall and 7.5 feet wide. It's just the biggest. There's a certain size limit that fits in an airplane, sadly, luckily, there's only in Europe. There's only the airport in Luxembourg where container planes big enough, land and start that can ship that, not Frankfurt or London or
It's nice.
Paris.
One of the
It's only
smallest countries has
Luxembourg.
one of the biggest
Yeah,
airport
strange. It's
abilities.
peculiar.
So, and why the switch to color? And do you still sometimes photograph in black and white?
Well, I mean, some things have very simple reasons. For example, when Bernd Becher became professor of photography at the Academy in Düsseldorf, and I was one of the first 3 students, there was only a black and white lab. So I photographed in black and white, but it was also a conscious decision because the architecture photographs, I imagined, I was not interested in the colors, but I was interested in the, in the structure of the place. So if you would have like yellow buildings, beige buildings, a green building, that would have been totally uninteresting to me. But also I didn't have the means. Plus, when Bernd, the Academy, decided to get a color head for the enlarger and the developing machine, I still didn't have, I hadn't made any color pictures. The first 5 color pictures I took of when I made a project about Beaugrenelle in Paris that my friend Thomas Struth had showed to me. Thomas Ruff helped me to make some prints of it because he was the only one, the first one who started to work in color in the class. Plus, color film was just more expensive to buy, and I didn't have much money.
But I'm interested in your description of the CERN space as I love this idea that it's a bunch of engineers who are actually sculptors in disguise, right? That they're creating these forms that have structures and have a formal logic to them. And do you, when you're photographing these technological sites or labs, do you ever take a photograph in black and white to reduce everything to its form and structure and system, or do you still, at this point, work purely in color?
No, actually, the color is essential in this. I mean, I'm very interested. I mean, for example, this picture is not as big. That shows actually the cabling, some of the cabling of the recording devices of that plasma physics experiment in Garching nearby Munich. There was a 2-minute exposure because you could hardly see anything there. What I'm picking up is a gesture, of this your compulsion and the entanglement. Which this one of the early, that was the second the second theme I photographed had to do with plasma physics. That's a view in another Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics in Greifswald, which I found nice because this where Caspar David Friedrich was born, and I liked the idea that between Caspar David Friedrich and this location was interesting time arc, so to speak. And I looked down on a part of what's later a huge ring that they built, and there's something, a gesture which later was very important for me, photographing animals, because what I wanted to do there is a gesture of giving up, of like your mortality, and just go like, you're releasing, the holding the energy and just saying, there's no holding anymore anything. That's why, and in a way, the gesture, the dramatic gesture, or the theatrical gesture of things are important to me, that I notice them, and I enjoy to show them or try to record them. To talk to people.
So I have a last question before we open it up and make it a broader conversation, and that has to do with the most recent work, which seems that it's smaller groups, tighter compositions, with the couple and then with the family, the black family with the small boy. And I wonder if you can speak to whether those are a continuation of your portrait series, or whether there's any difference now that the portrait series is something that you return to, let's say, with those photos.
Yeah, the portrait.
That one has more people, but the other two are smaller groups.
Yeah, I think the family, they're a continuation of their work, because for many years, actually for a very long time, I thought, okay, the family portraits is something that always interests me. Only I don't encounter, I'm just not, I don't make it, I don't put an announcement in the newspaper in June 2023, you can call Struth Studio and you apply for a family.
You'd get many people, I think, if you did do
yeah,
that.
exactly. But so this is, for example, these people are, that's my brother here, that's pictures on the screen, who lives in Hamburg, and these are friends, a gay couple, friends of ours in Berlin. This is a family, the woman here is a very old friend of my wife's, and they moved from London to Berlin, so I met them more, I came to know them more. And these are our neighbors who live across the hall from our, in the house where we live, the apartment house where we live in Berlin. So we know them since 13 years. And then also the family portraits, you change in a way that I change. You're getting older, feeling you're more comfortable in a situation, or you're dealing or less comfortable. So you change slowly, like as everybody in life has new experiences, and so I've been having so this continuous list of people that I would like to photograph, because something in the narrative of who they are I find interesting, touching, or just that I can somehow examine and be in that situation of having that experience with them. Because I noticed that with everybody who I photographed, there's some particular connection, because we spent these 3 or 4 hours together in the planning, and then they get a print, and it's something as if I see something intimate about who they are, and they see me working a situation where I'm not so I'm more nervous making a family portrait than photographing at CERN or photographing forest or something like that.
No, I think that goes back to your opening statement, where you're saying that it's not photography per se that interests you, it's the subject of your photographs, and that it has to speak to you. And I can imagine that these portraits do that. I want to open to the room. I have plenty more I can ask in case we have a shy audience, but I suspect we don't. See, already we have Marc-Angelil racing to the front. So there are microphones. You have to wait for the microphone because the Zoom audience needs to hear you amplified.
Great.
Mark.
Well, thank you very much for this amazing conversation. Is when I heard, and Sarah mentioned it in her introduction, that you would have the author of a book and the subject of the book together is absolutely fascinating and extremely rare. And what is even more interesting in this case is that the artist-author becomes the subject of your work. And if I look at your work and I see Thomas Struth, then suddenly, squeezed between Wittgenstein on one side and big data on the other. So I'm extremely fascinated by this idea of you working in series as a theoretician, and then because Struth is finished for you now, no? And so you moved on. Yes, exactly. And so you move on now to big data. So I'm sure there are continuities and discontinuities, and maybe you could address that.
I actually don't think it's finished, but it's finished as the book. But because new things occur to you, I'm staring at these images, and I've talked to them for years. I mean, in some ways I sort of talked to Thomas in my head, but I was talking to the images, and things like the portrait of Eleanor and Giles Robertson, where the older couple sitting across the table. I cannot sit across the table from my husband and not think of that photograph. I'm like, no, we should sit some other ways, because now I feel like I'm these people. But for me, really, a couple of things really fascinate me about the work. And one is, well, when I first encountered it in a big exhibition in 2002, one of the Paradise series was on the outside, and I'd never seen that, and I didn't know to expect it. And at once I thought two things. One is, what does this have to do with the streetscapes and whatever? And then I immediately thought, oh my God, it changes them all in relationship to each other. So I had this kind of full-blown thought, which was really unusual. But I think what I really, over time, appreciate is I like the mutations, the restlessness, the searching for new things, the interest in the world. And for me, in terms of my work, I really like developmental systems. How do these things relate? They strike me in deep ways as they go from here to there. And so the thinking through of that process of how work transforms, because ideas remain, right? And they get rethought and they get repositioned. And so this was a process of many different, hundreds and hundreds of photographs, which to me, and I don't know if I've ever said this, and he might hate this, but I've got to say, in that dealing with it, Wittgenstein was dead, right? He could hate what I did and I wouldn't know. But sort of dealing with a live person who I didn't contact, and he contacted me, he's always been amazing at saying, you just write whatever you write, that's what you see, and all of that. But this whole sort of concept of watching something develop, to me, is really interesting. And so I've thought of it as like the world's most beautiful data set. Like, how do these things go together? Just sort of sits in my mind, and the new possibilities. I'd love to be a curator and sort of like play with them.
I like that, from beautiful data to now big data.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think what for example, this picture, if we stay with, go back to the space shuttle. Yeah, this one. That I was at Cape Canaveral with an assistant, maybe 5 days or so. We had somebody with us who said it was very, very strict with, no, you cannot go there. Don't step over that cable. And when you're in an environment like that, it's very, very strange because, it's kind of messy, and so to find this position and frame it in that way is two negatives, like with a parallel shift that has so much of what we're looking at is the underside of Space Shuttle Endeavour. And there's in the middle, you don't see that far away, but that red thing is in the center, close to the other two front wheels. And so I'm standing in the back. And what I liked about this is that this looks like a little bit like a piece of Chinese armor from 5,000 years ago. It looks so utterly handmade. It's also looks, you're very imperfect and very vulnerable in a way, and you see some of the black parts are replacements. And then the way the reflection on the vitrine on the left and these steps there, or that yellow sort of thing on the right, and in the corner that thing that goes through the corner of the image, which actually I tried to one point digitally to remove, and when we had removed it, I thought, no, it has to be in there, because it's like looking at something like this, and it indicates the happenstance and the very foreground that's not in focus, and then I think a lot, shall that red and black band on the far left, shall that stay in the picture or not? I just love composition, and I'm extremely aware of every little thing. Does it have to be in the picture, or should it better not be in the frame? Because they all inform each other in a different way, and they practically do the similar thing what you describe in the interconnectivity of the whole thing. It happens with all the details in these pictures. For example, this one here, that came about just as an example for one development. After I was photographing technology already for a while, two things happened. I thought I would like to photograph something in Berlin where I live, where I can just go from the studio, take a car, put the equipment in the back, and go there and photograph. It doesn't work out, I go another time, and not in Buenos Aires or in Tokyo or in Houston. So I thought, and then medical. I've not done something with medicine where technology and the body, just come in contact very closely. So I asked my assistant, and we thought, Charité, the big hospital in Berlin, and my assistant who helps me with these things, we found this Da Vinci remote surgery. Is this thing that's used in prostate operations. We contacted the surgeon and sent some books or so, and he said, I can come and look at the machine. The machine looked very boring. It's just a product designed thing that says nothing. And I thought, maybe could I watch an operation? And he said, why not? So I like a week later, I found myself witnessing an operation, not this one, and I realized the students come in, medical students, so it's not that it's so unusual that are people present. But it took me a long time it took me actually three operations to understand the composition and find what needs to be lit there. But I couldn't, of course, I can't say, you just hold a second, or can I move that tool because it's not enough in the foreground, or so I stop 1 second. I have to change the film. So you had to go 3 times. And I've maybe, I don't know how many. I took sheet film. I did just sheet film and digital, and I made certainly like 100 and something exposures. And I had this idea to photograph the nurse in the front who was operating, was sort of helping one of the 2 nurses, and they look at the screen, they don't look, and see the interior of the patient. And I had this idea, I want this picture of the nurse with her glasses, the reflection, this Renaissance picture idea, and I want to see the screen in the reflection of the nurse's glasses, and all these things that I was thinking and trying. And then at one moment she stepped out of the picture, and I made an exposure. So I would go through all these photographs afterwards. I think, Dad, this is the one that's interesting, and not all the pictures with the nurse in the foreground, because it's like the technology is bending over the person, like almost like an insect or a strange entity, and also all the tools in the foreground were exactly in the way that they're not. None of the details of the tools graphically draw too much attention, which in many of the other pictures There were always like this stainless steel container was a bit too big, so you look at the picture, oh, there's a stainless steel container, and you have all these disturbing or misleading graphical dominant details in a way. So all these things matter very much.
Ron.
Thank you. Thanks for letting us see into your world a little bit, and thanks all three of you for letting us listen to your exchange, which has been really invigorating. I have a question. Looking at the photos, which there are many ways I think one could read them, obviously, so I'm going to try just one. But looking at them, there's something that runs alongside the content of the image, which is simply texture. And by that, I just mean the stuff on the photographic paper. There's a very particular way in which you use texture, I would say. I think it's more true in the non-portraits than than in the portraits, but I'm very taken with that. And at times I find myself looking at them and disregarding content altogether, simply enjoying the texture alone. And I wonder if you would comment about that, whether it's wires or people or surfaces or almost anything. I can find myself, like the view under the space shuttle, all of that armature is very similar to me to the wires. But I wonder if you would comment on texture, so to speak, the role of that in that work.
Interesting question. I think maybe the first thing that comes up is that it's enjoyable. I mean, the texture of the representation of texture through photography. Is that what you mean? Yeah. No. I mean, I have to say, I loved painting. I loved the smell of the oil. And when I was 15, 16, 17, and I painted, sometimes I had to like really force myself not to start licking the oil paint of the palette. This sounds pretentious, but it's really true. And of course, photography, I love picture making, but photography is not a very sensual medium. It's very cerebral medium, and and then also it's a simple thing. It's a transformation from 3 dimensions, from sculpture into 2 dimensions, where you lose a lot of joy. I mean, so if you can't walk around it, unless you hang the photograph from the ceiling, which I've done also a few times, but it's very frustrating in a way. And I'm always, for a long time, thinking, I would love to overcome photography. I want to, but certainly I'm not going back to painting. So would I become a sculptor? It's a bit late, maybe, in life, but and in a way, it's really. I mean, now I print all my pictures with ink, with inkjet at the studio myself, which is a big difference compared to sitting at a professional lab and waiting for the next C-print to come out and talk to the lab assistant what they should do. It's very enjoyable and yes, quite beautiful to have that so close by.
Others? You've got Thomas Struth here, who can answer anything you ask him. It's an opportunity. Yes?
I just wonder if you have any comments on the simulation of photographs versus photographs.
A simulation?
Of photos. So like trying to craft such that the image will look like a photo. it's our daily practice has become, more or less.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I see that in the context of a very much larger question where where humanity will be going. I mean, I remember very many years ago when I was in Japan. I think for the first time in 1986, I walked in the Ginza. I walked by a your window with a with a Sony. At the time, they had already made like a very high resolution TV screen, and I walked by on the street. And so I looked at this screen with a very today that's normal, but at the time I thought, wow, if that will become the standard, people's psychology will get very, very strange. And right now, I'm just wondering a lot, what the effects of technology will be. The internet, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the communication thing. I follow, because like we always have to lease Photoshop now, which I saw coming many years ago. Said to my assistant, I bet you one day you cannot buy Photoshop anymore, you have to lease it, and then they can ask whatever price they want. And now the last thing was that you have, you can make faces more happy or more sad and younger and older. And a friend of mine was a composer and a sound engineer, told me a few years ago already, in audio it's the same thing. You can take the voice of Goebbels, and turn him into an opera singer, or you let Goebbels sing Wagner or Schumann or Schubert Lieder. What that makes me ask is the stability of identity in a certain way, where you just have the experience of, I'm sitting here, I'm, and where you're not constantly under pressure of like defending your physical and psychological integrity against the shower of attack for one reason or another, and you don't even know what the reasons are while you're being attacked. And the small thing is only for example, like 2 days ago, I went into a shop in New York and bought 2 T-shirts for our son, and when I paid, on the screen it said, when you put your email address in, you get $10 off. I thought, are you fucking crazy? I mean, excuse my word, but yeah.
We'll erase
and I
that
thought,
part.
now they're buying. They're giving everybody that $10 to get the email address to bombard him, to use your email, for advertising and then they sell your email to other people for $20. I mean, this is like.
So that actually ties in. I think that's a very interesting question and a very dark one, but it ties into, there are 2 topics that don't appear so much in the book, but I think they're latent in your work, and I want to hear from both of you. One is technology and the sort of the reaches of technology, both in your technique and in our possibilities or their constraints, and the other is politics. Because I think you're deeply political in your social thinking and in your regard to all of the subjects that you photograph. And I wonder where politics fits into the construction of the argument. So that's for you, Nana.
Yeah, well, Thomas has had series or shows that he's called Nature and Politics. Is that the titles? And certainly it's in there. And there's little bits that I bring it out, but I don't bring it out as a whole separate topic. I don't know why.
Well,
I mean, just more so that it becomes part of this discussion. I mean, I could have pulled it out as a separate topic, but I guess I saw it as part of this later discussion and how things get to be looked at. I mean, I'm now just like, I'm not thinking well because I'm sort of running through other pictures that I might have brought in that you know, could go into that discussion. So,
I mean, I think actually, in a way, you're paralleling your own approach, Thomas, which is finding structure, series, systems, and allowing those topics to appear through that.
yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, it was responding, and it isn't the most top note. It's kind of embedded in the layers of things, and so if you're going to write another kinds of, I mean, like I've written other essays that look at sort of relationships of different of these images around, like kin was one that came out in Threshold, for example. So I could imagine writing this, but it wasn't sort of central to the argument other than it's part of a later stance, but I could imagine it's embedded, I think, in a lot of the things, your choices fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I have often thought about this, and my argument for myself was always, well, I come from a country where you're just not long before I was born, propaganda was very through photography also an extremely destructive means of forming your collective opinion, and I just prefer when things are too evident or too obvious. I think then like the observer has nothing to do. Yeah, it's okay. I see it, and I prefer somehow that to give the public or the viewer something to. I mean, from my point of view, some things are pretty obvious in a way. Sometimes I find it too obvious in some of my pictures, but. Of course, I want to draw people in and offer something interesting to spend time with, and then like make their own observations.
Just to throw in, this is essentially, I mean, the argument that Adorno makes in this commitment essay is exactly about not being so direct as a way of being political, exactly drawing people in, because part of the whole act of being political is developing a stance where you do think and you have to, and if it's done for you, you're missing a central part of the political. I don't write about that, but I thought I'd throw in a little teaching moment.
Yeah, this one, for example, I mean, it's El Capitan, and I just like the different components, and I think, okay, when people look at it, they'll put the pieces together somehow, like the mountain as an object of of adoration, but also you don't spend time with it. You just stop briefly, make a picture, and then you go and have lunch. It's sort of but I wanted to say something again about the composite pictures. You have been observing the development of the digital retouching of pictures, since it started, where people, let's say, you made portraits and then you take the mouth away and you draw the skin over where the lips are, and many of these alterations and stuff like that. And of course, in the car industry, they photograph a car in the studio, they photograph a street, and in Cannes, and then the models are photographed somewhere else, and I'll put it together. I've different sensations with this. One is, for example, like I'm not interested in watching, looking at something that tells me how excellent of a composer somebody was at the computer. But on the other hand, if it makes sense as a narrative, for example, there's this great picture by Jeff Wall of sudden gust of wind after Hokusai, where there's a man and some other people in an open field, and there's a huge array of papers flying through the air, and the coat of the guy is hanging like this, and it's a beautiful narrative and dedication to Hokusai's print, and it consists of like maybe 45 pictures he composed, but during the process of wanting to tell that story in a modern style, Jeff didn't veer off the track. He stayed on the track of love to make that picture, and that's why it's so successful. And it's composed of 45 or something exposures. But also he has work where I felt just emotionally he lost the track and put too much brain in it, and then in the end he didn't know anymore what. Like it feels like that to me. So it's very, very different. But I've seen not so many examples where I look at it and my reaction emotionally is just something I don't. It's just it's kind of hiding. Is it? Because the question is it about seeing or is it disguising? I think maybe that's the main difference. When it is about something that somebody saw and really felt, it's always okay.
I think that's an interesting example. That's a little bit of a transition between what you were asking about and your photographs, because with Jeff Wall, that's manipulating shots that he was working with, whereas I think what you were talking about was the manipulation of imagery purely on the computer, and no photography to begin with, to construct an image, and with such realism that it implies that it's a photograph, sort of what you were talking about with
maybe
the
I've not seen stuff like this.
Go up in the trays. Other questions? Whoa, now they come out. See, this is what happens. You're getting close to the deadline. It's classic for our audience. Please.
My question is more an elaboration from the previous discussion that we are having. Basically, these images, the way they are portrayed in this presentation and my familiarity with the work is very shallow. And a question goes to Nana about how do you see this as an enchantment towards the world in Thomas's work? But from the comments that Thomas made in the last 15 minutes, it seems that there is also a deep disenchantment about technology, which is not apparent in the images. But then I also wonder if that disenchantment is with the photography, if with the new photography movements, or is it more a disenchantment of the technology that goes behind it? So I'd like for you to comment more about that.
And I'll go for it.
In terms of, it was interesting because when Sarah first mentioned them, she said in some ways cold, and I looked at Thomas immediately, and I say lots of things. I don't know what he's going to think about. They're kind of conversations in a certain sense, and so I just they've never struck me as cold. They've always just struck me as a fascination with this sheer amount of connectivity and what goes into making any little piece of these immensely complex events. But also, what fascinates me is then the sheer physicality of them, right? And the sort of dumb physicality, like we must connect this point to that. and I know Thomas says, and he can speak for himself, but sees these as in their objectness in various ways, you know, and how they present themselves as, you know, as though, I don't know, like creatures or sculptures or something, whatever word is used. So for me, I sort of start to see both of those, like how does that draw this together, and to think about, like, if I had to spend time thinking, like, why is he doing this exact frame, I could never figure it out. So that is an interest. So I always work from the viewpoint of, okay, this is what he's chosen, and what does this produce? And I'd say really the whole book is written by what do we really see in these pictures going on, and as these ongoing conversations. And so the technology ones are so dense, a lot of them, although there's ones that have real space, you know, made and begin to produce other scales in that, because some of these you don't know really what that is, but then you have the clues of like what tends to be wires and tools and gauges.
I mean,
Yeah.
I would hazard an answer as well that it is it's sort of an oscillation between an enchantment and a disenchantment. In other words, part of there is an incredible beauty to even, you know, the being under the endeavor or seeing that operation, and yet there's also a side, especially when you hear you talk about them, and I think that's where you're saying this is coming out more in this conversation, where the sort of scary side is emerging.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that you know, despite my real intentions in the beginning about this, I've always been slightly worried that that would be read as a celebration of technology in a certain way.
So the danger of beauty.
Well, I mean, it's hard to answer that. In a way, it has a little bit to do with, hey, please look for yourself what it looks like, and many things are so much less perfect than this idea of than the promise of technology, the excitement of technology. There's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of I find, for example, something like this. When you look at this, it has this kind of animalistic quality. That's a picture I took in October last year, and it looks also a little bit exhausting. You know, and you have to imagine 3 people who work on this at sound, all these specialists in different buildings, and they, for example, that piece of tape there and the pink foam, that when somebody goes underneath, they don't hit their head. Or, then I think one thing that was sort of in a way formative to me when I was very young, in the 60s and 70s, the experience of seeing your critical articles about your social housing that showed apartment blocks badly photographed. And I thought, this is something's wrong there. I was never able to explain that, but I made a number of pictures of apartment blocks that are very sachlich, so they're very kind of neutral, and look at an apartment block. You're like a big apartment block. You're just as an object, as a piece of sculpture, because I felt maybe it's fairer to say, oh, okay, the people who live there, they're not responsible to have built that. So I always included a sense of empathy for the researchers who are, by and large, most of the time very fantastic people. They've been incredibly generous to me to an extent that's unbelievable. You're opening the doors for me, taking their time. We talk a lot, and I know, what we exchange what we're interested in. On the other side, they often see things on their premises they've never seen before, because I say I want to see everything, and I was just at the IBM Research Lab in Westchester, and the guy showed me everywhere. I did one scouting day, and then 2 days of photographing. So, in a way, a different photograph that I've never taken before is this one, which is also at CERN in Geneva, where my friend James Beecham showed me, who works there, and showed me everything and helped me to make these pictures. Showed me this empty space, big space, where there were just 2 very large retired magnets down there, and the whole space looked a little bit like a Palladio cathedral. And I tried to make that picture, which didn't work because the wide angle effect was too big. And I was spending time there. I saw this debris on the floor and made a handheld photograph with a 12,000 ASA, because it's sort of one example of how things end up somehow in the end. They just fall apart, and then they're just on the ground. And I thought this is a particular component in that exhibition in New York that I wanted to introduce next to this one, which is a retired detector. That was 2 years ago, no, in 2019 on my first visit. I saw this and I thought, I found it interesting and made a picture. And in a way, I'm still not so sure. It's not as successful a picture as most of the other ones, but I still, in New York, I put it across from the working detector, the very big picture. So you have a working detector perspective and a retired detector, and somehow I found that, I'm an artist. I can do whatever I want to a certain limit, and make your thesis or comparison. So I have certain amount of freedom.
And a certain empathy for the retired detector himself,
exactly.
Or herself, itself. We have a hard stop, alas, and so if you have additional questions, those of you who came in late on your questioning, you can rush him at the stage if you want, but we have to actually stop, and I want to thank everyone in the audience, but I especially want to thank you, Thomas and Nana, for bringing this to us, and again, a shout out for a really terrific book. So thank you very much.